You're 18. It's your wedding day. You're wearing a flame-colored veil, and everyone's been telling you this is the happiest day of your life. They lied. You walk into a room. There are people you've never met. Attendants, slaves, a woman in ceremonial robes. "I am the Pronuba," she says. "I'll guide you through what happens next." Your eyes land on something in the corner, a wooden shape covered by cloth. Nobody mentioned this. Nobody prepared you for this. Your mother's hands were shaking this morning when she braided your hair. Now you understand why. In minutes, you'll know what's under that cloth. In minutes, you'll understand your mother's tears. In minutes, you'll realize your wedding night has nothing to do with love. It's about proof, about ownership, about the law. This isn't fiction. This was real. This was marriage in ancient Rome for patrician brides. A ritual so disturbing that historians wouldn't write about it clearly. So shameful that when Christians took power, they smashed the statues, burned the texts, and tried to erase it from history completely. When that cloth comes off, you'll see what Rome wanted forgotten forever. The year was 89 CE. The Emperor Domitian governed with rigid certainty, crushing dissent and demanding absolute conformity to tradition. And 18-year-old Livia Tirsa, a fictional name we use to represent the countless unnamed women who endured this rite, was about to discover that Roman marriage existed in two forms. The public celebration witnessed by the city, saffron veils glowing in torchlight, walnuts tossed through crowds, cheerful chants echoing off marble buildings. And the hidden version, carried out behind sealed doors before witnesses who might one day be summoned to recount every detail before a magistrate should the marriage's validity ever be questioned. What she was about to endure belonged to a class of rituals so uncomfortable that ancient Roman authors rarely described them directly, and Christian writers centuries later tried to eradicate them from memory entirely, going so far as to smash cult statues and burn manuscripts. Before diving deeper, if forgotten horrors of the ancient world intrigue you, subscribe to Grim History and tap the like button. And once you reach the moment that unsettles you the most, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let us begin. Earlier that day, long before the ceremony that would change everything, the morning had been filled with beauty. Deceptive, fragile beauty. Her wedding procession felt dreamlike, almost unreal. Livia wore the traditional flame-colored veil, the Flammeum, its distinctive yellow-orange hue unmistakably marking her as a bride in transition. At dawn, her mother had parted her hair with an iron spearhead, a ritual meant to ward off evil spirits, then woven it into 6 elaborate braids tied with woolen ribbons. Every detail followed strict ancestral prescription, customs passed down through generations without question or mercy. At the temple, the sacrifice proceeded smoothly. The priest interpreted favorable omens from the gleaming entrails of the sheep. Their shine suggested the gods smiled upon this union. Her father recited the ancient words, transferring her from his legal authority into that of her husband. His voice stayed steady despite the finality of what he declared. And she repeated the formula brides had whispered for generations. Ubi tu Gaius, ibi ego Gaia. Where you are, husband, there I am, wife. A vow declaring that she no longer belonged to herself, that her legal identity had been subsumed entirely into his. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a wealthy grain trader 25 years her senior, had met her only 3 times before this day. She knew virtually nothing about him, except his reputation for shrewd business dealings and his need for legitimate heirs. Yet by law, the ceremony had already begun binding her to him. Or rather, it had initiated the process. Because in Rome, the public ritual was only the opening act. The truly decisive moments waited at the end of the torchlit procession. Inside a house she had never entered, surrounded by people she had never chosen to meet, subjected to rites she had never been told to expect. Along the streets, the crowd sang the traditional Fescennine verses, lewd, explicit, intentionally embarrassing songs meant to amuse the gods and ward away evil spirits through bawdy humor. Young men shouted vulgar comments through her veil, their words making her cheeks burn with humiliation and confusion. Her mother had assured her earlier that the songs were harmless, merely a charm for protection, words without real meaning. Yet Livia had noticed her mother's trembling hands while braiding her hair that morning. She had seen the tears hastily brushed away when their eyes met in the polished bronze mirror. She remembered the last whispered warning, delivered with quiet desperation. Do not resist. Whatever they demand of you tonight, do not resist. Resistance only makes everything worse. Trust me, daughter, I know. Livia hadn't understood then. The warning seemed vague, meaningless. Now, as the procession wound through darkening streets toward her husband's home, dread began to coil in her stomach like a living thing. By the time they reached the home of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the final light of day had vanished entirely. Only flickering torchlight illuminated the scene now. The doorway had been trimmed with wreaths of greenery and wool. 2 blazing torches flanked the entrance, indicating that inside, a marriage would be completed according to ancient custom. The singing outside grew louder, more insistent. Someone hurled walnuts at her. The hard shells caught in her veil and scraped against her skin. The gesture was supposed to ensure fertility, but it felt more like mockery than blessing, as though the crowd knew something she didn't, and found cruel amusement in her innocence. Marcus stood in the doorway, and behind him, Livia noticed movement. Far too many figures waiting in the shadows. Tradition required that the groom lift the bride over the threshold to avoid the ill omen of stumbling. Though the custom reached back to a much darker time when brides did not willingly enter their husbands' homes at all, when marriage began with abduction rather than ceremony. Marcus lifted her with surprising gentleness, carrying her across the threshold without a word. Once the heavy door shut behind her, muting the songs and laughter outside, Livia finally saw clearly who waited inside the atrium. An elderly woman in elaborate ceremonial garments stepped forward first. "I am the Pronuba," she announced. "I have overseen this ritual for 32 years. Tonight, I will guide you through what must be done." Her grip was firm enough to prevent any thought of retreat. A priest of uncertain rank stood nearby, murmuring prayers under his breath. 3 enslaved women held basins of water and folded cloths, their faces carefully blank. And in the corner, half hidden beneath draped linen, stood a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. Livia's heart began to race. "What is that?" she whispered. "All in time," the Pronuba said, her tone allowing no questions. "Welcome to your husband's house. The sacred rites must now be completed." Marcus had already disappeared into another room, leaving Livia alone with strangers whose purposes she couldn't fathom. Few people today speak honestly about what Roman marriage truly was for the women who entered it. It was not an expression of romance or sentiment, not a celebration of 2 lives willingly joining in partnership. It was a transaction, a legal transfer of control, observed and documented as meticulously as the sale of land or livestock. Under Rome's oldest laws, a wife passed fully into her husband's authority, placed in manu, into his hand. He held over her the same legal powers he held over his slaves. the right to control her property, to determine where she lived, to decide whether she could leave the house. Even the theoretical right to judge matters of life and death within his household. By the early imperial age, when women like Livia crossed that threshold, the laws had softened outwardly. Women of wealth could possess some property. Divorce existed, though it carried social stigma. Some forms of absolute paternal authority had changed, yet the foundation remained utterly unchanged. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's control to another, from father to husband, with or without her genuine consent. And like all major legal transfers in Rome, confirmation was required. Consider how Romans handled land sales. Witnesses present, rituals performed, inspection of boundaries conducted, sealed documents prepared, every detail recorded. Nothing was assumed. Everything was verified through testimony and physical evidence. And they applied this same relentless logic to marriage, with one grim modification. The object being transferred was a human body, and the value being guaranteed was that body's ability to produce legitimate heirs, heirs whose legitimacy might one day be challenged in court. So Roman law required both the bride's virginity and the consummation of the marriage to be verifiable, not merely claimed. In the most formal patrician marriages, particularly those involving significant property or political alliances, this verification could become invasive beyond modern comprehension. Livia stood trembling beside the shrouded figure, unaware that what followed would remain seared into her memory forever. A rite so disturbing that later generations worked desperately to deny it had ever existed. The Pronuba tightened her grip and guided Livia toward the veiled structure. Livia's heart pounded so violently, she felt its rhythm in her throat, in her temples, behind her eyes. Her legs felt weak, unsteady. Whatever stood beneath that cloth would fundamentally alter her understanding of herself, her body, her future, and she had no way to turn back. The door had been barred from the outside. Marcus would not intervene. Her father had already left, his duty completed. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the Pronuba murmured, her breath warm against Livia's ear. "You must seek his blessing before your husband may approach. The gods must witness your submission to divine will. This has been done since the founding of Rome." Livia swallowed hard, trembling so intensely that the Pronuba had to steady her with both hands. She had never heard of this deity. No one had mentioned his name during all the wedding preparations. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the cloth. The witnesses leaned forward with unnatural intensity. Even the enslaved women froze in place, their eyes fixed on the veiled form. The entire room held its breath, waiting. When Livia removed the drapery, she immediately understood the reason for its concealment, and a small, strangled sound escaped her throat. Beneath the cloth stood a carved wooden figure of unsettling anatomical precision, a phallic idol, massive and unmistakable. Not a small fertility charm like those worn on necklaces for luck, nor a crude garden figure meant to ward off birds. It was deliberately crafted, life-sized or larger, built for a specific ritual function. That function became terrifyingly clear as the Pronuba began to speak. Mutinus Tutinus is an ancient god of marital union, the Pronuba explained with practiced formality. To ensure fertility and divine favor, brides must demonstrate submission to his power. You will approach the sacred image. You will invoke his blessing. And you will perform the ritual that every patrician bride has performed for generations. Mutinus Tutinus was a shadowy Roman deity linked with fertility and marital initiation. Ancient writers referred to him only in passing, and almost always with visible discomfort. as though even speaking his name felt improper or obscene. The god had a shrine on the Velian hill from Rome's legendary founding until it was finally demolished in the 1st century BCE. Perhaps tellingly, around the same time that some of Rome's most invasive marriage customs began to soften. Centuries after the practices had ended, once Christianity had gained firm control over Rome and its territories, the Church Father Augustine described the associated ritual with fury and barely contained revulsion. In his work, City of God, he claimed that Roman brides were required to sit upon the god's phallic emblem before joining their husbands in bed. And this act took place in front of witnesses as part of formal patrician wedding rites. He condemned the practice in the strongest possible terms, calling it obscene, degrading, and proof of pagan corruption. But Augustine did not invent these claims. Other early Christian authors referred to the same ritual, all hinting that it was too shameful to describe in explicit detail. Arnobius insisted that brides were made to straddle the symbol while witnesses watched. He described Tutinus's awful phallus, with immense shameful parts, upon which Roman matrons were mounted in equitare. Lactantius argued that merely speaking openly of the ritual defiled one's mouth and spirit. Even Varro, a pagan Roman scholar writing long before Christianity's rise, mentioned brides being presented to Mutinus Tutinus in language that implied physical contact, though he carefully avoided explicit details. Perhaps out of respect for religious mystery, perhaps out of simple discomfort. Modern historians, understandably uneasy about the implications and reluctant to accept the most disturbing literal interpretations, have often softened these ancient descriptions. Some suggest that brides might have simply perched briefly on the statue's lap in a purely symbolic gesture, a token acknowledgement of the god's power without actual penetration or trauma. Yet the language in the ancient texts resists such comfortable reinterpretation. Augustine specifically chose the verb insedere, to settle upon, to mount in the sense of mounting an animal. Arnobius's phrasing is even more explicit, strongly suggesting actual penetration. And Lactantius's absolute refusal to describe the specifics at all. This silence seems far too emphatic if the action had been merely a light symbolic touch or a brief moment of sitting. The official justification offered by pagan sources was fertility, an invocation of the god's generative power to grant the couple many children. But there was almost certainly another unspoken purpose woven through the ritual: to crush any remaining resistance in the bride's spirit, to demonstrate absolute submission to divine and human authority under the supervision of witnesses, to prepare a virgin through controlled trauma for what the law would demand next from her husband. Livia stood rigid before the wooden god. Lamplight cast its obscene shadow across the wall behind it. The shadow seemed to move and writhe in the flickering light. The Pronuba stepped in close. Her weathered hands were surprisingly strong as she adjusted Livia's stance, arranging her limbs with cold precision, guiding her body toward the statue with absolutely no softness or sympathy. "Please," Livia whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I don't understand." "You will," the Pronuba said flatly. "All brides come to understand. Now invoke the god's name. Say it clearly so all may witness." "Mutinus Tutinus," Livia stammered, tears beginning to stream down her face. I seek your blessing." The onlookers remained absolutely motionless and silent, their presence transforming the act into something documented, something legally witnessed, something that could be testified to if the marriage's validity was ever questioned. And in that moment, as the Pronuba's hands guided her firmly toward the wooden idol, Livia finally grasped the full meaning of her mother's quivering warning that morning. She understood why those crude songs had been sung in the streets, why the crowds had laughed and thrown nuts, why her mother had wept while braiding her hair. She understood, with absolute and crushing clarity, what it truly meant to become a Roman wife of the patrician class. In theory, she could refuse. She could scream, fight, flee. But refusal would shatter the marriage agreement entirely. She would be sent back to her father's household not as a respectable bride, but as a rejected woman, perceived as damaged, undesirable, fundamentally unfit for marriage. She would disgrace her entire family. Her younger sister's marriage prospects would be destroyed by association. She would become a permanent scandal, a subject of whispered commentary at every dinner gathering, an object of pity and contempt. Her life, as she had known it, would effectively end. And so, with tears streaming silently down her face, with her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, with the Pronuba's iron grip on her shoulders, Livia did not refuse. The ritual that followed is too invasive to describe in explicit detail here. But ancient sources make clear it involved physical interaction with a phallic idol that went far beyond symbolic touching. The purpose was simultaneously religious and practical: to invoke divine blessing for fertility and to begin the physical process of defloration under religious sanction, in the presence of the god rather than the husband, witnessed by others who could later testify that the rite had been properly completed. When the ritual concluded, Livia felt shattered, disconnected from her own body. She couldn't stop trembling. Enslaved attendants immediately stepped forward, carrying basins of warmed, perfumed water. They washed her with surprising gentleness, murmuring prayers intended to cleanse her after contact with the divine. The washing was meant to purify her, to mark a transition. Yet it served another, more practical function. It prepared her for what would happen next with her husband. The Pronuba's voice cut through Livia's days. "You have honored the god. Now you will honor your husband. He waits in the wedding chamber." What happened in that chamber is difficult to determine with precision because Roman sources rarely described the wedding night in detail. It was considered a private family matter. However, we know that consummation was considered essential to complete the marriage bond. We also know that the Pronuba traditionally prepared the bride, led her to the wedding bed, offered instructions on her duties, and then withdrew to allow the couple privacy. The idea that witnesses remained in the room to actually observe consummation belongs more to medieval European customs than to verified Roman practice. In medieval Europe, especially for royal marriages, there were bedding ceremonies, where guests escorted the couple to bed. But even then, witnesses typically left before the actual act. The few extreme cases where intercourse itself was observed were highly unusual and scandalous, even by medieval standards. For Rome, we simply don't have reliable evidence of routine witnessed consummation in the way the script originally portrayed. What we do have evidence for is the invasive ritual with Mutinus Tutinus, verified by multiple ancient sources. The Pronuba's role in preparing the bride and instructing her, well documented in Roman texts. The legal requirement that marriage be consummated, clear in Roman law. The possibility of medical examinations in cases of disputed virginity, mentioned in Roman medical texts. The display of bloodied sheets the morning after, in some Greek and Roman contexts, suggested by some sources. So while the wedding night was undoubtedly traumatic for many young brides, entered with fear, often involving a much older husband, expected to produce proof of virginity, the specific scenario of multiple witnesses remaining in the room throughout the act appears to be speculation rather than documented Roman practice. What we can say with certainty is that the bride had been subjected to severe trauma even before reaching that chamber. The ritual with the wooden idol had already violated her body and spirit. The Pronuba had already instructed her in what would be required, and she had no choice but to comply. Because the marriage contract demanded it. Because her family's honor depended on it. Because Roman law made her her husband's property. When Marcus entered the wedding chamber, Livia was already broken. She sat on the edge of the bed, still trembling, staring at nothing. "I will try to be gentle," Marcus said quietly, though his voice held uncertainty, as though he wasn't entirely sure what gentleness meant in this context. Livia said nothing. She had no words left. The night passed in ways she would never speak of, not to her daughters, not to anyone. By dawn, the transformation was complete. Whatever girl named Livia Tirsa had existed before sunset no longer existed. In her place sat a Roman wife, a matron, a vessel for producing legitimate heirs. In the years to come, she would bear children across the next decade. She would manage her husband's household with efficiency. She would supervise enslaved workers. She would host elaborate dinners. She would fulfill religious obligations at temples and household shrines. She would move through the world with the external poise expected of a Roman matron of good family. Outwardly, she would seem composed, competent, respectable. But of her wedding night, of the wooden god, of the Pronuba's cold hands, of that first terrible evening, she would say nothing to anyone. Not to her mother in their rare private moments. Not to her daughters when they reached marrying age and looked at her with questions in their eyes. Not to the other matrons who surely must have endured similar rites, but who maintained the same universal silence. There were no words she could easily use for such experiences. And in any case, she had never heard another woman speak openly of hers. Livia's silence was not unusual. It was universal. Women of her status did not typically record such experiences in writing. Men did not describe them in personal letters or memoirs. These rituals were woven so tightly into the fabric of elite married life that detailing them would have seemed unnecessary, like explaining the appearance of daylight or the sensation of breathing. Everyone who needed to know already knew. No one needed to say it aloud. That's why modern historians struggle so profoundly to reconstruct what actually happened inside private Roman homes on wedding nights of the highest social classes. Much of what we do know comes from scattered, uncomfortable fragments. Outraged condemnations written by Christian authors centuries later. Brief mentions in legal commentaries discussing marriage validity. Incidental references in medical texts about virginity and defloration. And archaeological traces whose significance becomes clear only when compared with these fragmentary, written sources. The lack of detailed first-person accounts is not proof of deliberate conspiracy or cover-up, at least not initially. It testifies instead to terrible familiarity. These rituals were the water in which elite Roman women moved, so omnipresent and accepted within their social class that describing them out loud to other Romans of the same class felt redundant. For nearly 1,000 years, this was marriage in Rome, or at least marriage for the patrician families who maintained the most ancient and invasive rites. Generation after generation of high-born brides walked the same torchlit routes. Generation after generation of mothers whispered the same warnings to daughters. Generation after generation of young women faced variations of the same night, the same divine mandate, the same absolute submission to custom and law. The system lasted because everyone within it, husbands, wives, entire families, religious officials, accepted the underlying logic. or at least saw no way to challenge it without destroying their own social standing. Property had to be verified before legal transfer. Marriage produced legitimate heirs who would inherit vast fortunes and political power. And therefore the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation demanded proof beyond mere assertion. Women were understood as the vessels through which family lines continued, the means by which property flowed from one generation to the next. Within its own framework, the system made perfect logical sense, even as it now appears monstrous to us, even as we recoil from the cold mechanics of treating human beings as assets to be inspected and certified. The end of these practices did not come because Rome collectively recognized it had crossed a moral line and decided to reform itself from within. Change came from outside, from the gradual spread of Christianity and the transformation of Roman values during the long, tumultuous centuries of the 4th and 5th centuries CE. With new religious doctrines came revolutionary new premises about human dignity and the nature of marriage. If women possessed immortal souls equal to those of men before God, they could not be treated purely as property to be verified and transferred. If marriage was to be understood as a sacred sacrament rather than a legal contract, it could not accommodate ceremonies that church leaders denounced as obscene violations of bodily dignity. If modesty was a cardinal virtue, then the presence of witnesses during intimate moments became intolerable rather than necessary. This shift was neither swift nor simple nor complete. For centuries, pagan and Christian customs existed side by side, sometimes blending, sometimes in open conflict. But gradually, across cities and within elite households, the old wedding rites were abandoned, altered beyond recognition, or carefully masked so their original meanings were lost. And as they faded, so did the evidence. Statues of Mutinus Tutinus were systematically smashed or hidden away. Texts that mentioned the wedding night rites in detail were quietly removed from public libraries or simply left to deteriorate in abandoned corners. Wall paintings that hinted at such practices were plastered over with images of Christian saints. The Pronuba's role shrank until she became little more than a symbolic attendant with no real function. Within just a few generations, the complete knowledge of what Roman weddings had once required for patrician families disappeared almost entirely, surviving only in faint echoes buried within obscure manuscripts that would be discovered centuries later by curious scholars who could scarcely believe what they were reading. The Christians who reshaped Rome were not merely eliminating embarrassing remnants of the old pagan world. They were actively constructing a new civilization upon the ruins of the previous one, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge what those ruins had once upheld and celebrated. Their efforts succeeded almost entirely. Today, when most people imagine Roman marriage, they picture saffron veils glowing in torchlight, joyful songs echoing through marble streets, walnuts scattered for fertility, a groom carrying his bride over the threshold with a smile, a picturesque mixture of ritual and festivity that speaks to enduring love and romantic commitment. They don't imagine the wooden god. They don't imagine the Pronuba's cold grip. They don't imagine girls shaking with fear while being told resistance would destroy their families. But fragments endure. Fragments always endure. In Augustine's furious condemnations, in Arnobius's uncomfortable descriptions, in Festus's brief notation that such a god once had a shrine until someone tore it down, in the careful silence of thousands of women who left no written record of what was done to them. The fictional Livia Tirsa died around 31 CE at approximately 60 years of age, having lived as a wife for more than 4 decades. She had raised her children to adulthood, She had fulfilled her household duties with competence. She had hosted gatherings. She had supervised enslaved workers. She had met every expectation imposed upon her by family and society. But what did she recall when her mind wandered back to her wedding night in those final years? Did she relive the dread, the humiliation, the helplessness? Did she, over time, find a way to reconcile herself to what had been done, telling herself it had been necessary, sacred, required by the gods? Did she hope desperately that her daughters would somehow face a gentler version of the same ordeal? Or did she simply accept the ritual as inevitable, the natural order of things that could never be questioned or changed? We cannot know. She left behind no written account, no journal, no letters describing her inner life. Roman women of her social standing were not expected to record such deeply personal memories. The vast silence surrounding these rites comes not from the men who designed them or the priests who sanctioned them, but from the women whose bodies served as essential components of the legal structure, while their thoughts, feelings, and trauma remained entirely irrelevant to the histories written by men. We rarely know what they felt. We know only what was done to them. And yet, we know enough to understand why generations of Christians labored so intensely to erase this side of Roman life from historical memory. Rome is so often romanticized as the glorious foundation of Western law, political order, architectural achievement, and sophisticated civilization, acknowledging what Rome demanded of its women, particularly women of the elite classes who were subjected to the most invasive rituals, complicates that heroic image considerably. It reveals an uncomfortable truth, that refinement and brutality can coexist seamlessly within the same culture. That a sophisticated legal system can function perfectly well alongside practices that systematically dehumanize half the population. That monuments of marble and institutions of governance can be built upon foundations of trauma that were so normalized they barely seemed worth mentioning. The rites themselves are long gone, destroyed by Christian reformers and cultural evolution. But the women who endured them once existed in the flesh. Women with names we'll never know. With thoughts they were never permitted to record. With pain they were expected to bear in silence. For Livia, for her mother, for her daughters, for the countless unnamed brides whose wedding nights were rituals of divine mandate, social verification, and absolute submission to male authority sanctioned by both law and religion. They lived, they endured, and they were silenced. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.